Welcome back to the SENWA studio out here at Optus Stadium. 13 12 55 is the Barrett and Dade open line if you want to give us a call. Paul in Dianella has done that. He wants to talk about West Coast and the State 18s. Paul, welcome.
Good morning, Duff. Disappointing to lose yesterday, but the reality is I think at this stage of our rebuild it's more about how we play, and that's where I see the improvement in the club going forward, and which will hold us in good stead. And the reality is the byproduct of losing yesterday is we cement ourselves at the bottom of the ladder. But what that means is what I watched over the weekend was pretty exciting. And I think from a recruiter's perspective for the club, we need to lock in Will Dersma as pick number 1, CDT as pick number 2, and then we need to trade up for Gold Coast first pick via Port Adelaide and take our boy Freddie Rodriguez. And if we can do that, then our future is looking pretty bright.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, what they will do, West Coast, and obviously it is a bit contingent on what happens with Oscar Allen, probably a bit contingent on what happens with Harley Reid as well. There's now talk that Harley Reid will be at West Coast next year, so whether that means he signs an extension or whether that means he simply puts off the decision until the end of his third season, that's going to be a fascinating watch. I would like to see, from West Coast comfort point of view, some sort of decision made this year on Harley, but certainly pending what happens with Oscar and pending what happens with Harley, they could have a lot of top-end draft collateral, and certainly the two blokes you mentioned from Victoria, and also obviously young Freddie Rodriguez, who was one of the stars for West Coast in the 18s on Saturday. They're all would be very valuable picks. Thanks so much for your call, Paul.
No worries. Thanks, Duff.
All right, Paul's thoughts there, calling us on the Barrett and Dade open line. Scotty Waters, of course, played footy for West Coast. He played footy for Fremantle. He played footy for Sydney. He coached the St Kilda Saints as well as being a premiership coach at Subiaco. He was also, of course, a member of our most famous Teal Cup team back in 1985, the team that won the title in Perth. He joins us on the show. Scotty, welcome.
Morning, Duff. Pretty optimistic Monday as I'm looking down. I've got a lot of likes on my list here. One dislike and only one do better, but pretty optimistic, mate, when I look at 4 or 5 likes here on a Monday morning.
So what do you like, Scotty? And we're talking specifically West Coast, or are we talking about competition in general?
Well, a little bit about both. I mean, we'll start with, have a look at the ladder, and you look at the top 8. We've got 2 Queensland teams, 1 Adelaide team, 1 WA team, 1 Sydney team, 1 Geelong team. I'm splitting them from Melbourne. And 2 Melbourne teams in the top 8, right? So I think that's a pretty healthy look for the national competition. So I'm starting with a big positive there, mate.
Okay. What about West Coast yesterday? Did you watch the North Melbourne West Coast game, and what were your takeaways from that?
Oh, look, good to see Oscar Allen back actually getting amongst the footy again. I mean, we forgot that he is a good player. So I think that's been fantastic to see him back. I've got him as a dislike because 39 inside 50s, 1 goal, that's pretty horrific football. They did everything else right. So it's a tough one because we know where they're at. At the end of the day, they've got to go back, know that was a game that they should have won, and their efficiency hurt them. But there were things to like. And just a highlight for me out of that game, I don't know if you really saw Liam Ryan's left-handed one-hand pick-up without breaking stride in the second half of that game. We're looking at a very rare talent in Liam Ryan, and I just hope we appreciate how good some of these players are. It got me thinking, Duff, just on who have been the highlight reel players that we've loved watching at West Coast, and I whipped up a few here. You know, Harley Reid gives us something. Every game he gives us something that gets us out of the seat, but Ped Matira, David Wirapunda, Chris Lewis, Mark Lacroix did some phenomenally freakish things. Chris Judd bursting clear of stoppages. And I'm going to throw in a little smoky in Mark Miranda as well. Probably not as big a name as some of the others, but he did some special things. So to our listeners, I'd be interested to hear who are the players that, you know, they just come to watch because they know they're going to get something special. And I think we get that with Liam Ryan.
You were at West Coast in the early 1990s, so you saw Lewis in 1990 when he had that incredible season when West Coast surged into the finals, and you saw Matira in the finals in 1992. Who had the best of that, do you think? Lewis in 90 or Matira in 92?
Oh, gee. That's impossible to split. Chris Lewis was a sublime footy player, and he could make the difficult look very easy. He was so smooth. He never looked ruffled. He always looked composed, and he had an incredible goal sense. But in 1990, he did his damage around the midfield. I always look at Chris, and like, he was a superstar Hall of Fame player, but I wonder how good he would have been if he'd spent more time in the midfield. As far as just killing you with 5 touches, there was no one better than Ped Matira. What he did off the wing in 92 was, I still don't think we've seen a better grand final performance. If I was looking for a sublime midfielder, I'd probably go Chris Lewis, but gee, I don't know. That's a very tough call. Very tough call. You'd be happy with either, wouldn't you?
Oh, you would be. The interesting thing about Matira's 1992 grand final is that it was so good that we forget what he did in the other finals in 1992. I remember the great duel between Matira and Darren Pritchard in the first final against Hawthorn at Subiaco, and they kind of went at it for 3 quarters, and then Matira just went to another level in the last quarter and was probably, more than any other single player, probably the guy that got the Eagles over the Hawks in what was an incredible game of football and set up the possibility of the premiership. Yeah, he was certainly a special player.
He was incredible. I think if you had to try and separate the difference, I think Ped Matira could beat you with 20 possessions. I think Chris was more of an accumulator at his best, but the thing that they shared was their ability to take the ball at ground level without actually losing any momentum at all. Peter was probably the best in the business at that, and Chris Lewis, I don't think I ever saw Chris fumble the ball ever in an illustrious career. They were just beautiful to watch.
Got a text from Frank saying, "How could you leave out Nick Nat of your highlight reels at West Coast?"
No, I knew that this reel was going to be short. The list was going to be impossible. I rattled off 6 or 7, more than happy for the listeners to throw in, a few more. And Nick Nat, he will always remember his bursts from centre bounce and some of the things that he did. He probably almost hit goal of the century. Ended up being point of the century with that centre bounce stoppage, but he could do things unlike any other as well. I mean, West Coast have had some incredible players over the journey.
Harry Edwards looks like a young defender who's starting to emerge, Scotty. He's had a checkered AFL career so far. He's had to sit behind Tom Barrass and Jeremy McGovern, and obviously they're both absent now. And suddenly, with opportunity and responsibility, we've seen Harry Edwards start to emerge a little bit in the last few weeks and had 13 intercept possessions and kept Nick Larkey goalless yesterday.
I think that's confidence starting to come out now, Duff. I mean, he's getting a run at it. He's confident in his position on the side, and we're really starting to see him explore his capacity in the back half. So there's less of him being absolutely side by side with his direct opponent. He's referencing off his direct opponent, but he's playing the game now on his terms. And 13 intercepts that's elite level stuff. So he's a long-term player now for West Coast. It's great to see, out of the rubble of the last couple of years, we are starting to see players emerge, and he's another key pillar for them going forward. Very hard to find. One of the things recruiters look for is that intercepting defender. I don't think there's ever been a more important role in the last 5 to 10 years of football, and West Coast have got a very good one right there.
Are you seeing the style continue to emerge under Andrew McQualter? Because if you take away the goal kicking, which, let's face it, was flat out horrendous in ideal conditions, the rest of the game probably looked the way West Coast wanted it to look, didn't it?
Yeah, definitely. We're seeing them playing the game in the front half. I mean, I know they'll be sitting there looking at the missed opportunities, but to have 39 inside 50s in a half of football, you're doing a lot of things right. I also think, and we mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, they've just injected real grit through their midfield. They're getting really honest, contested, efforts from so many of their midfielders now. That's giving them an identity and a brand of footy that they can build on. If I could be critical of West Coast over the last 3 or 4 years, their soft underbelly has been their midfield contest. They've rectified that. Now they just need to add a little bit more polish to their game. But if I was a West Coast supporter, I'd be impressed with what I'm seeing from Andrew McQualter and the way that they're emerging.
Freo at the break, Scotty. What are you seeing? What are you liking? How are they placed?
Oh, look, they're a top four list sitting in 8th position, right? So there's part of me that's frustrated that they're still sitting in 8th when I believe they missed opportunities early in the year. But, you know, a season is a season and you've got to peak at the right time. You've got to win enough games to put yourself in contention. So everything is building. You know, they've got Fife coming back. There's talk of, you know, when will Young, O'Meara and potentially Walters, will they play a role in the back half of the year? And I'm convinced that at least 2 of them need to, for them to really challenge for a premiership. But look, they go in favourites in their next 5 rounds of football. You know, the next 4 weeks they've got Essendon, St Kilda, Sydney and Hawthorn. Now, they're all very winnable games. Their draw is very favourable. I think they sit in a great position to challenge for the 4. And if they can get, like any other team, because it's the same for Collingwood, it's the same for Brisbane. If they can get all the right pieces in the right place at the right time, this is a side that can go extremely deep and should be contesting in a grand final.
So you called the Fife thing a few weeks back on the show and you said, get him right, bring him in the back half of the season and have a shortened, more intense version of Nathan Fife through the back half. There was an encouraging first step along that line with him being used as a sub against Gold Coast and used successfully. I guess the question on one of those other veterans, Michael Walters, are you optimistic about the role that Michael Walters can play in the back half of the season, or are you sceptical whether he's got much to offer?
Look, Michael's 34, and he's been an amazing player. He's been one of the best players Fremantle's ever produced. I think it's going to be a very challenging period, whether they can get him back into the mix. And if anything, I think there's more upside potentially with Fife and O'Meara coming back into that system. It's hard to know, Duff, exactly where he's at physically. It's been a long time out of the game now. So would we love a Michael Walters bobbing up, kicking 2 goals, creating 2 or 3 goals come finals time? Absolutely, but only the physios and the conditioning staff really know where he's at right at the moment. That Fife is already back in the mix. If they manage him correctly, I think we'll have a player come finals time. You know, imagine getting 1 quarter of brutal football from Nat Fife at the start of the game, not the end of the game, and actually setting up a contest for Fremantle. That's why he's the most important player still. I know that's a lot to throw at his feet as a player in his twilight, but if there's one out of the mix that I'd want available for half a game of brutal contested football, it's Nat Fife.
Have you got to do better for us?
Yeah, to do better for me, it's AFL head office. You know, just recruit better. You know, they've had to go to Clubland to get Greg Swan. They've had to go to Sydney and now take Tom Harley. This is taking top-end talent away from the clubs. The nepotism, the boys' club mentality, the recruiting from within is hurting the game and it has to stop. They had the opportunity to get Brendan Gale a year or so ago and another amazing administrator. He's now gone to Tasmania. It's time that the AFL open up their recruiting policy and find best talent, not just those that have been sitting inside head office. But it's a shame that this talent now has to come from Clubland. So AFL, do better, look wider, and make sure our game is administered the right way.
Do you think, so it's always fascinated me that people that graduate into the higher echelons at the AFL, you very rarely see someone who, say, spent time at a club in Western Australia and so understands the travel burden and that sort of thing. Does the talent pathway for AFL executive talent need to change a bit? That seems to be what you're hinting at the moment, because obviously they've taken 2 veterans out of clubs who maybe should have done their time in the AFL before now as opposed to being poached now.
I think that's very true. I think for a long period of time at AFL head office, administratively, we've seen recruiting coming from very, very close to, I guess, the Melbourne base, the Melbourne Mafia, for want of a better word. I mean, Trevor Nisbet should be playing a role. Brian Cook should have been playing a role. These administrators know what a national game looks like. We've had too many administrators at AFL head office that they're Melbourne born and bred and they don't have a national perspective, and that's not good for our game. So it's time we really looked at that. And, you know, we've got a great game. It needs to be administered with a national perspective, not a Melbourne first perspective, and it's time that changed.
I couldn't agree more with that, Scotty. Thanks for joining us on the show today, mate, and always appreciate your insights. And obviously, we've got a big back half of the season still ahead of us, so it's going to be fascinating to see how it plays out, and hopefully more wins for West Coast, and hopefully a top 6 finish for Freo at the end of the season.
Yeah, exciting finish to the year, Duff. Really, really looking forward to seeing the back half of this season.
Good on you, Scotty. We'll talk to you again very, very soon. We're back with more after the news.